Frances, thank you so much for joining the show today. It's a privilege to speak with you. Would you mind first briefly introducing yourself?
My name is Frances Widdowson. I'm very honored to be on this podcast. I was a tenure professor at Mount Royal University until December 2021 when I was wrongfully terminated. And I've been studying Aboriginal policy for about 30 years and started to take a in-depth interest in the residential schools in 2016.
Why was it a wrongful termination from your perspective?
Well, the arbitrator Jones did say that I was wrongfully terminated, but we're still hashing out the actual context. But I think that David Philip Jones, the arbitrator, did not go far enough in terms of exoneration, because I argued that I did not engage in harassment at all. I was just responding to what's called an academic mobbing, where a group of professors went after me because they disliked me disagreeing with their positions.
Would you mind sharing kind of what happened there and your understanding of what took place?
Sure, I'd love to. And for people who want to find out more, I don't want to go into too many details just because it's a very long and complicated ordeal, but I have documented my entire case on the website www.wokeacademy.info. So that contains all the documents. But basically what happened is there was an Indigenous scholar activist who was upset at me asking questions about indigenization. In 2020, she decided to go after me on social media, and it was generally known at Mount Royal University that personal social media accounts were not a matter of the university's concerns. But because they wanted to protect this prized asset, indigenization asset of the university, they specifically changed their policies to go after me. And so that resulted in me having this long kind of Twitter exchange with about 40 faculty members. And I was found to have engaged in harassment and creating a toxic work environment. And then because I found that social media was now covered, this resulted in me filing 18 complaints against my colleagues for what I considered to be far worse harassment. 6 of those colleagues were found to have harassed me. And then one of the complaints I made was found to be frivolous and vexatious. And so I got found to have done that. And that was the accumulated kind of process which resulted in me being terminated. And then 12 additional items were added after the fact that were pretty much made up by the president of the university. And all of them were found to be unsubstantiated except the harassment allegation. And as well, I would not accept responsibility or show remorse. And that is completely true. I will never accept responsibility or show remorse for what happened, because I was just trying to defend myself from many years of people going after me at Mount Royal University.
When you hear 40 professors come after you, I think in any other circumstance, you would think, wow, 40 people against one, that person is being the one being harassed, not the one going against 40. So that's surprising to hear. Would you mind sharing what your position is on indigenization?
I think that it is destructive so indigenization, in my definition, which is somewhat different from decolonization, the two often appear together. But my definition of indigenization is bringing all aspects of Indigenous culture into the university. And decolonization is taking out those aspects of the university which are perceived to be oppressive. So they're sort of two sides of the same coin. But the indigenization process has a number of very innocuous aspects that no one could disagree with, such as, bringing in various Aboriginal cultural features, such as Aboriginal artwork into the university, certain removal of barriers, which make it difficult for Aboriginal people to participate, renaming buildings after notable Aboriginal figures, those sorts of things. But the biggest issue that I took is the incorporation of Aboriginal ways of knowing, what's called Aboriginal ways of knowing, into the curriculum, which I saw many what I considered unscientific elements being brought in. And that's really what I was taking issue with.
Okay. I wanted to understand that context, just to understand how you've gotten to where you are. Is there anything else you think, before we kind of dive into the more complicated topics, people should know about you or about your history?
Yeah, so I should mention it was not just indigenization, which was one of the big problems that I had at Mount Royal. It was also the issue of trans activism. And so I was criticizing, I wasn't even taking a position on it. I just invited Megan Murphy to come and speak at an event in 2019, which resulted in a number of trans activists getting upset. But it was stated in the arbitration hearing that I should not be reinstated at Mount Royal because I believe that there's only two sexes. And this is something that says that trans people don't exist and that it denies their humanity. So that's another major issue, which I am also heavily involved in at the university.
May I ask, we obviously have a lot to discuss here today, but I do want to understand you a bit more. And so I guess my last question on that is, what was that experience like to have the university come at you in such a way? Did you ever expect that this would be a chapter of your life?
I had a feeling it would be. I actually had been recording all my meetings since 2019 because a colleague had said to me that it was likely I was going to have people come after me. So I've been involved in controversial kinds of discussions around especially Aboriginal traditional knowledge since 1996. So I was really prepared for the kind of criticisms that I would be getting. The difficulty became in 2014 when the university began to take political positions on things, which gradually resulted in it becoming more and more difficult for me to make critical arguments about what the university had taken a position on. So for about, I guess, 6 years, it was becoming worse and worse to be able to state positions without getting attacked in the university. And then in 2020, after the the death of George Floyd, that's when the universities sort of fell apart in terms of their academic mission. So I was prepared. I guess I wasn't really prepared for the grueling nature of the arbitration process. That's something I didn't have any knowledge of, and that was very abusive. That process, unbelievably abusive, which I'm still, kind of trying to get my head around. I'm still going through it because my case is being appealed to the Alberta Labor Relations Board in December 2000 of this year, 2025.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. I did have the opportunity to watch your interview with the journalist from the CBC based in Kamloops, and I found that rather interesting, to say the least. But I did want to give kind of the fundamental principles of this conversation from the outset, because I do think you invited the lady you were speaking with to participate in a good faith conversation, and she didn't respond well. So I'd like us to agree that the search for truth is paramount in our conversation today, that free speech is critical to this conversation. And I also want us to embrace that this issue is somewhat complicated. Do you feel comfortable with that?
I definitely do. I completely agree.
Okay. Is there any other principles we should be keeping in mind as we dive into this complicated conversation?
I don't think so. I think it is important to focus on the ideas as opposed to the individual, which, and I know that I do fail in my own life from time to time in this regard, but I'm usually provoked. That's my excuse. But some people tell me I should take the high road. But I've watched you, Aaron, and I find you to be a very congenial person who never takes cheap shots or at people. So I think that kind of goes without saying in terms of the way you approach things.
I greatly appreciate that. So my first question is somewhat controversial. Are you an Indian residential school denier?
Depends on how you define an Indian residential school denier. And I think it's intentionally distorting how this term is used. My understanding of what it is you deny that the Indian residential schools were genocidal. That seems to me to be actually what the correct definition is that people really mean when they're talking about it. And yes, I am an Indian residential school denier if the charge is that I do not believe that the residential schools were genocidal.
Okay, let's explore that a little bit more, because as I think you did see my video on this, kind of laying out from the very early stages, 1907 forward, report after report showed that children were dying at an increased rate because of the sanitation, because of the lack of air movement within the buildings. They didn't have a lot of airflow. So you have people with tuberculosis in these buildings. They're not having healthy meals. They're not properly cleaned. And then people are dying as a consequence of those factors all coming together. And the government knew that from 1907. A report comes out saying that the author thinks that this is criminal negligence. And that continues on and on and on for dozens of years, tens of dozens of years. What is your response to that? You're saying that doesn't lead into genocide, but they did know that the situation was bad and they did nothing about it and they let it continue. So how do you grapple with that?
So, and again, this comes down to definitions of things, which I know is rather annoying, might be somewhat annoying for your audience, because this, of course, is the academic way of doing things. So the definition of genocide is intent to destroy. So that's really what you're dealing with. And then, of course, there's the 5 criteria that the UN convention puts out. So there was certainly neglect and terrible abuse that took place in certain contexts, but that does not mean there's an intent to destroy the group. And it's interesting that you bring up Bryce, because that was one of the things that I did take a little bit of issue with in your previous video. Bryce, and there's an article written about this, which people, and that doesn't mean that it's completely correct. There might be some problems with this article. I'm just saying it's a bit of a counterpoint to these claims that are made about Bryce, and it's by Greg Piasecki in the C2C Journal, which is kind of going through Bryce's actions. And Bryce's report was not buried by the government, according to him. And I haven't studied this in any detail myself, so I'd have to look in more detail about this to figure this out. But he claims that the government did discuss the report in Parliament, and the government did decide to try to rectify some of these items that Bryce had identified. But Bryce and the government at the time had quite a kind of cantankerous relationship. He did not think he was being listened to enough by the government, and so on. So it's something which I think is a bit more complex, the relationship between Bryce and the government and the response to Bryce's report, than I think many people have kind of discussed in their coverage of that. So the fact that the government would try to do some remedial things about that, now we can say definitely the government didn't do enough, these kinds of questions, but we're not dealing with the same threshold that we would if we were talking about what would actually be considered to be a genocidal action, which is really the attempt to get rid of this group out of the political landscape, which we saw in the Holocaust, Rwanda, all these kinds of cases. So it's certainly there were serious problems with the residential schools. There were things that the government should have done differently. but I don't think that genocide is the right description.
I think this
situation.
also leads into the term cultural genocide, which multiple reports have concluded it was in fact a cultural genocide. And I'd be interested to understand how we, from your perspective, square these two pieces, because overwhelmingly you hear from government officials saying we need to remove the savage from the Indian and we need to civilize the Indian. And so that position, if you're saying that to all of the Indian agents, that gives them a certain confidence in what they're doing. And so the government in Ottawa might be saying that and saying we should do a little bit more, to your point, and grappling a little bit more with Bryce's report. But when you hear comments from Sir John A. Macdonald and others saying this is kind of our general intent, we want to get rid of the Indian, we want to civilize them, some may hear that and go, okay, well then I need to do a little more. I need to push these people. I need to get them approaching things differently, which could lead into a feeling that they have carte blanche to do more than what perhaps is being discussed in Ottawa. Is that a fair assessment from your perspective?
Well, I would take much more issue with the terminology. So I never accepted the words cultural genocide. If we're going to be a stickler about it, we could discuss the word culture side. So using the words cultural genocide doesn't make a lot of sense, because genocide is talking about destroying a genetic grouping. So it's an extermination of a group based upon ancestry, not about culture. So when we're talking about culture side, which is just eradicating the culture, which the language that is used at times, one can see that was a very harsh assimilationist kind of approach, which, you know, we certainly can argue against today. Those statements, of course, are picked out of a whole bunch of other types of remarks that would have been made. So they're the kind of most extreme kind of statements that you would see, which you would not see, you know, like all the time or even most of the time. But I think that trying to deal with cultural problems is much, much different than going after groups on the basis of ancestry, because we often do have that problem when we have cultures, very, very different cultures coming together, and you have to sort of make decisions about how to live together with one another. And sometimes the argument is made that this particular cultural feature is not very conducive to the whole society thrive. Those kinds of arguments. And, you know, there's many instances of this in across the country where, for example, and I'll just bring up an example, the potlatch in British Columbia. So it was argued this is kind of cultural genocide to ban the potlatch. But there was lots of problems with the potlatch in terms of its reiteration in the modern context because of the surplus that existed. And you did have a number of Aboriginal leaders who wanted the potlatch to be banned because they were poor. They were poor Aboriginal groups, so they were put at a disadvantage when they were expected to give back as much or more than the other group that was providing these gifts. So now maybe it was way too harsh to do that. There should have been another approach, but it wouldn't have been done with an intent to destroy the entire culture. It was more, we've got some problems here. We're trying to figure out how to create a better society. Now there could be, you know, more draconian things going on too. But I think these things have to be looked at a lot more on a, you know, in terms of the various complexities to them, and not just, you know, the government banned the potlatch and therefore that was cultural genocide, or what kind of argument that or culture side. I guess I don't like the words cultural genocide at all. And I think that actually using those words has resulted in problems because we were asked to go along with the words cultural genocide, which people understood was not the same as genocide. And now we have people saying that cultural genocide is genocide. So I think a lot of people don't think that cultural genocide is genocide. So it's a bit of a confusing kind of tactic that was used with those words.
And in all fairness, I do think terminology, we can get lost in a terminology debate. I think we're seeing that with Israel and Hamas right now. There's much debate about whether or not this is a genocide or if it's ethnic cleansing. Like, is that word appropriate? Is it fair? And then that becomes its own debate on what the definition is and whether or not it fits the definition, rather than looking at the lived experience and what's actually happening on the ground. The other piece, maybe as a principle I'd be interested in, is, to me, it matters less, to your point, what people said, but the result is that First Nations cultures have been, in large part, absolutely destroyed. And so whether or not some chiefs or some leaders supported that or some didn't, they didn't have votes in the House of Commons to decide whether or not they supported that. We don't have those type of votes. But then, too, when I reference Siam Yatiliot as the last fluent Halkla speaker in the Stolo territory, that to me demonstrates that the cultures were destroyed, whether or not we want to call it a cultural genocide or not, and that it wasn't an open-minded discussion like you and I are having about the common good and about what's reasonable. When you put something into law, it's no longer up for discussion on what a middle ground might look like and how to advance cultures. It's removing that from any ability to debate, which is why I'm against making the term Indian residential school denier into law, is because it removes all space for complex discussion. Is that a fair assessment from your perspective?
I would tend to agree. First of all, there would be some discussion about whether that was true. You know, is it true that Aboriginal culture was completely destroyed, and you know, was the destruction due to the government's efforts, or was it just due to the fact that, you know, you're dealing with a very dominant economic system coming in, which has certain requirements that results in some features just no longer being viable in that context. So the Aboriginal languages is a very interesting one, because as you are probably, I'm sure you're aware, Aboriginal languages did not have a written form before contact, and all the writing that's been developed was actually developed initially by missionaries. So many of the actual preservation of some of the aspects of the language have been due to the writing down of those languages, and we can continue to see this happening with all these various orthographies and so on. So that is kind of a bit of a complexity that's added into it. So, you know, in terms of the culture being completely destroyed, one, is that the case? And two, was the kind of the fact that some aspects are no longer being practiced, was that just due to the fact that they weren't really picked up upon in the capitalistic processes, the liberal democratic types of regimes? You know, what all sorts of things are going on here, and I'm a bit hesitant to see it as just that kind of one-way process, which definitely was part of the story, but I think there's a lot of other elements happening at the same time.
That's fair. I guess my pushback would be, one, when the French came, there was more of an ebb and flow, as I describe, and a willingness to participate in the culture and take the best of both and potentially build upon those. And the British did not bring that mentality of maybe we can intertwine. It was much just more capitalistic and disconnected and looking down upon, rather than, hey, we rely on these individuals and we need to collaborate with them. There were agreements that the government had made at the time that they didn't end up honoring that would have made a more middle grounded system. And the Indian residential schools, going back to that topic, have resulted in those things not being picked up anyways, because they were being put through a system that discouraged any form of their culture being practiced, in comparison if they were to stay in their communities and continue to practice what they were doing. We know that oral cultures can last much longer and have a more consistent passing on of information in comparison to written cultures. I often use Shakespeare as an example. Many people know Shakespeare is important. Many people can't tell you why his writing is important or what about his writing is so fascinating. And yet we take a lot away from Shakespeare in the culture, but within oral traditions, you can share that information and it's in a story form, which is much more consumable by our minds. That's why poetry is also very successful, is because it's a way of encouraging the mind to remember things and hold on to them. And so taking that away, putting people into schools would have, by proxy, taken away a lot of that cultural connection. So it's not that it was the marketplace didn't need it. It was that they were removed from the opportunity to have internal community marketplaces to continue to practice that.
Well, these are obviously very complex arguments. I think that what's called the pre or oral cultures, or cultures that have not yet developed writing, this is a very contentious area in anthropology as to how much is actually retained and how much changes with the times. And I think it's Mark Wittau, basically says that it doesn't really last. The actual item that is being preserved does not really last more than 2 generations. That's his position. Now, whether that's true or not, that would require more in-depth analysis. But I think with the schooling, and this is probably a big point of contention that you and I might have, is that in written cultures, the kind of schooling you have is much more regimented than in oral cultures, cultures that have not developed writing. The kinds of disciplines that you're trying to develop in societies is quite different. And so you kind of need to have more organizational processes in place, which doesn't really work very well with the local nomadic kinds of habits. Now, this has not been dealt with the same way with all cultures. And my colleagues, Dennis and Alice Bartels, studied Aboriginal people in the Soviet Union. And there was a different approach that was used by the Soviet Union, which would be an interesting one to study, which was the Soviet Union sent community educators into Aboriginal communities to travel with the reindeer herders. And that seems to not have had as much dislocating effects as the residential schools did. So perhaps that kind of organizational form of the residential school had some negative effects that could have been avoided if another approach had been taken. But, you're sort of dealing with the things that you have at that time. And it probably just would never have occurred to all these priests and nuns to do things any differently. You might be wanting to know that I'm an atheist myself, and I'm not right-leaning. I'm actually a socialist. So I don't really have any skin in the game for these churches or anything like that. And I think perhaps it was a serious problem to have the churches controlling the educational system. I don't know what else would have been possible within the context of Canada. And you mentioned the case of Quebec, which I think is a very interesting comparison, but you had sort of more of a peasant society in the case of Quebec, New France, whereas, as you correctly point out, the British system was in a much more capitalistic kind of orientation. So because I'm a socialist, I think capitalism has many serious problems, one of them being that it doesn't fully appreciate the humanity of people. And so that's likely that the humanity of Aboriginal people was not considered and appreciated as much as it should have been in that interactive process.
I may then owe you an apology. I do recall saying conservative voices like, and I may have listed you amongst those voices.
You did.
So
You did.
I apologize for assuming that. That is actually a very interesting point that I think makes the conversation more complicated, and
Yes.
that complexity should be embraced. Returning perhaps to the discussion on Denier, as you know, I have a huge concern with what Sean Carlton and his colleague,
Yes.
Mr. Justice, had put forward as a fundamental position on the term denier, because it doesn't actually mean that you're denying anything. It's raising questions, it's being critical. And again, when we're having these complicated conversations, that is a natural part of it. People who ask questions about how the Holocaust happened or the complexity of it, or say this might be contested or this is more complicated, those are not deniers. Those are people who are seeking to understand more. And at times, I do think those voices can move towards denying certain aspects, and then that can complicate the conversation further. And to me, it's a rejection of nuance. It's a rejection of the complexity of the situation. And when we say we want truth and reconciliation, we have to have people who are willing to go, we might have this piece wrong, or there might not be as much evidence here as this other claim. And we all have to be willing to participate in that discussion if we're going to do that, if we're going to have these conversations. And so I disagree with their definition of denier. I think it's really escalated the temperature of the conversation and is leading to a greater political divide than is necessary on this topic. Is that landing?
I think so. I do think that what is meant is residential school genocide denial, which would make sense because that's what the Holocaust denier label is about, is if you deny the Holocaust as a genocide. But I agree that I don't think that the word denier is, because there's going to be people like Norman Finkelstein, just to bring in the Holocaust example, who has been called a Holocaust denier himself because he's taken issue with some of the tactics that have been used by, the Holocaust remembrance types of activism and so on, to use against the Palestinians. And his family, almost his entire family, was wiped out by the Holocaust. So he can't obviously be denying that there were terrible things that occurred and there was a destructive element. So saying denier is a pejorative that is really feeding into attempts to silence people and prevent sort of disagreement from occurring. And that is my view. Like, I don't think that there should be, although I think that obviously the Holocaust was a terrible, destructive act, and I think it does meet the bar for genocide, I wouldn't argue that people who said it's not a genocide should be put in jail or suffer fines or anything like that, because I think it just creates a situation where people will be very afraid to, provide criticisms of different arguments. It just seems to me to be an anti-intellectual move intent on creating fear and make people think twice about raising a criticism of what's being argued.
And I suppose that this is the original intent, from my perspective, of universities, that in the universities, we should be able to have these types of debates, these intellectual debates where we both look at the definition and we go back and forth on whether or not something meets the definition. And I do think, to a certain extent, that does need to be not in the public square, potentially. That these types of intellectual debates are not always meant for common people who aren't interested in the technical pieces, because they're not going to have the technical definitions. They're not going to understand the nuances of the points that are being raised. And that's not to say that they're not worthy of coming in and learning those things, but that we will be in our ivory tower having more complex philosophical discussions on these things. That's what the universities are predicated on, that you can go somewhere and have debates and discussions, and not meant to deny people's reality or their experience, because like I don't think you or I would feel comfortable having this debate surrounded by people who were sexually abused in the Indian residential school system. That wouldn't be a reasonable ask for them or for us, because that's not the kind of conversation we're seeking to have or the conversation they are seeking to participate in. Does that land as well?
Well, I think it's up to people themselves, to decide whether they want to participate or not. If I were engaged in a conversation with someone who was asserting they'd been sexually abused, I definitely would need to be sensitive to that circumstance. But it becomes very difficult when we're engaged in an intellectual process. Like a person who's been sexually abused, it really has no bearing on whether the residential schools were genocidal or not. Like this is, it's kind of a separate issue. Now, if I were to question them on their memory and so on, I probably would not do that unless there was some wider implication that would have to be examined. But that's kind of a difficulty for pursuing the truth. You're going to generally enter into terrain that is going to make some people feel uncomfortable and not like what is being said. So that's, I try not to concern obviously I don't want to be needlessly inflammatory, but sometimes you just can't avoid it. Right. Because this discussion is going to go into areas that people are not going to like and are going to be opposed to if they disagree with it. And I don't quite know how to deal with that situation other than to say it's not my intention to cause offense here, but if we're going to seek the truth, we have to be pretty hard-nosed about going into areas that are not going to be appreciated by some.
I guess that's my point, is that you would assume that universities are the place to seek truth. Definitely. And that if you're interested in that approach, that is where you would be heading. Yes. And it wouldn't be into a past Indian residential school to seek the truth. Like the place we all agree should be the place for these types of debates should be in a healthy society should be universities. We should be having a bunch of students sit there. You and I can go back and forth. We can hash these things out and have a legitimate conversation based on the evidence, based on the arguments, and everybody is there agreeing to participate to that. But from my perspective, and I imagine you agree based on your experience, the universities are not living up to their obligations. And so these conversations are having to happen in a public forum where truth isn't always everybody's intent, where like when I post that video on YouTube, lots of people are telling me that I am denying the truth or ignoring reality and so the agreement isn't we're all kind of going into a good faith debate on what the facts are. And so to me, these conversations are being shouldered by people who are willing to make YouTube videos and comment online, because there's a rejection of responsibility within many universities to want to touch some of the most complicated conversations, which means they have to happen in a much more public forum than would otherwise happen in a healthy society.
Yes, and this is one of my major projects, is how to restore the universities to the academic spaces that they have not been entirely. There's never been a golden age of perfection, but I've been in the university system now for over 30 years, and the way universities were, 30, 40 years ago is very, very different than they are now. And we need to bring in methods to be able to reintroduce this now. And my favorite one is the spectrum street epistemology method, where you have a claim such as the remains of 215 children have been found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and you get people to state their degree of certainty about that, and then figure out what evidence that they would need to become more certain or less certain. That seems to me to be one of the best methods, because it takes it away from the highly polarized you're wrong, you're right, like that doesn't work very well in the university. But what we have to be focusing on is the evidence. What evidence are you using to make the claim that you are, and what is the quality of that evidence? And that's what I'm trying to do in all universities across the country, is bring in this method. And it's been interesting. It's been an interesting project doing that, but I think it has great possibilities for restoring the universities to what they used to be.
Then let's give that a try. I will lay out, as I did in that video, my understanding of the claim.
Yep.
The claim starts with these schools were set up with the understanding of removing the Indian from the child. They were specifically set up to be residential, meaning that they were not day schools. They were residential to separate children from parents, and with the intent of civilizing them, teaching them to read and write. And that over time, through different reports, not just the Bryce one, but throughout many reports, showed that they were unclean, unhealthy, and resulted in greater rates of death due to tuberculosis. The TRC concluded in 2015 that there were about 3,200 children who died, and that that number was verified, but that the number was likely much higher, with some estimates going as high as, I believe, 6,500 potential dead children as a consequence. And so with survivors' testimony, which if I understand correctly, you'll challenge as eyewitness testimony, which I don't think anybody disagrees is often unreliable, put forward that there's a location that they recall these children potentially being buried at, and then the 215 story comes out and it says there are unmarked graves in this location. And so using ground penetrating radar, which does not detect bones, it detects anomalies in the ground. And so that is, from my understanding, the basis of the claim. You have a document stating that the number is likely far higher. You have survivor testimony, and you have ground penetrating radar saying that that is the potential location. Is there any flaws in the claim as so far as I've made it out?
So first of all, you have the claim, which is the remains of 215 children have been found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. You have 7 mats: strongly agree, slightly agree, neutral, and then the disagree side. Okay. So where would you stand on them? What mat would you stand on in response to that claim? Would you strongly agree with that claim? Would you slightly agree with it? Would it be neutral? What mat would you stand on?
I would be somewhere in between slightly agree and agree.
Okay, so, and I would be on the strongly disagree mat in this case. So, and from what I understand your argument, and this is what you do in street epistemology as well, is you don't want to straw man, and this is one of the big problems with Sean Carlton, is he is constantly straw manning arguments. Like, I love he argues, steel man. So the steel man, you've got to steel man your argument, which is, one of the arguments seems to be that because the Truth and Reconciliation has found argues that there's thousands of deaths that have happened, that it's likely some of those deaths will be in that apple orchard in Kamloops, just because of the large number of deaths. And
if I'm not mistaken, 50 have been found historically.
49, yeah.
49, sorry. But yeah. So there have been discoveries, findings made, but that the number could be higher, yes.
But is it your position that 49 documented deaths at Kamloops, not to say that's an accurate number, that's just what we have as the documented deaths, at which, according to Nina Green and Jacques Riard, who are the 2 researchers who studied this, 25 did not happen at the school itself. They happened in home communities, in hospitals, and so on. But because there are these numbers of deaths, you expect to find some of those deaths would be in the apple orchard in Kamloops.
I think it would be a tremendous place to start, yes.
Okay. And so then it would be, so if you were to find that those deaths were accounted for in other cemeteries and in other burial spots, would that then make you less certain and you'd move to the neutral mat, or you'd move maybe to the slightly disagree mat, because those 49 deaths, according to records, cannot be in the Kamloops apple orchard because they're buried in the Kamloops cemetery, which is across from the St. Joseph's Church, or they're buried in other reserve cemeteries. Would that make you less certain of your claim?
I think no, because if we find that the report said that the documents were not properly filed, that the Indian Death Register was not well maintained, and that some documents were destroyed, that would still leave me open to the idea that there are also burials there. And if we found burials somewhere else, it would make me not more confident, but I would remain the same, because then it would tell me that there are more spots throughout. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the uncertainty in the records, the fact that because we don't have an accounting of every single death that has happened in the residential schools, we don't exactly know what happened to every single death that was claimed to be associated with the residential school. That makes you believe that there's some likelihood that those missing records mean that there's going to be children buried in the apple orchard.
Yes, based on the other pieces of evidence we've already discussed.
Okay, and in terms of so with respect, just to give you some facts about, and this is what Nina Green and Jacques Rillard do. Yeah. That's the important thing about these conversations, is that we need to figure out what the facts are with respect to this. Yeah. So, and as you say, the survivors' testimonies, some of that could be factual, but some of that might not be factual. Yeah. So, and we have a number of instances of this. Well, it depends on how far you want to go into whether you're going to believe the records of death certificates and so on. But in the case of Kamloops, the 49, I believe Jacques Rillard and Nina Green found 38 of the death certificates. So 38 of the death certificates show the burial place, or it's various cemeteries. So there's about, I think, 12 or maybe at most 15 where we don't have the death certificates yet for those names. But if we went to vital statistics and got the family members to go to the vital statistics division, we could probably get that. So anyway, that's the kind of work. But in terms of that, this is the kind of process that goes on with street epistemology. I'm not sure how much longer you want to go on this, but what I find with street epistemology is that it's great because you get the people to state their position. So you know kind of how certain they are. You know what the claim is. You know a certain amount of evidence that they're requiring. But you kind of reach a point where you have to be incredibly skilled to figure out how to move the conversation further into greater understanding. Yeah. And I'm still working on it. So I reach a point doing this where I'm I don't know what to ask you next. Yeah. To elicit to get and what I'm just trying to do is just understand why you believe the things that you do. I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm just trying to help us both understand why you believe the things that you do.
I like that approach. I guess my question back to you would be, if they do excavate and they do find 215 sets of bones. I think I saw one video that said you're likely not going to find bones depending on the years because they may disintegrate and be like soil samples of potential bones. Would that convince you that there are likely more to be found across Canada? Or what would you take away if they do find and excavate and find bones?
then we're moving into, well, first of all, I'm at the stage now and looking at this where I'm saying, in terms of parents saying that their child never came home from the Kamloops Indian residential school, we don't have one report of that happening. So that's the first thing. So we're not even at the state where. So I'm being skeptical right off the bat. I think that excavations are the only way that you can make a determination as to whether there are remains there, because you can't do it through ground penetrating radar. That just shows disturbances. You can't do it through stories, because the stories, we have many cases where people claim one thing and then the records show something else. And just in terms of my response to your kinds of arguments is, just because even if we have gaps in the record, that doesn't mean that those children would be buried in the Kamloops apple orchard, which is a clandestine burial. They could be buried in all sorts of cemeteries all across the country. It could be completely not clandestine. It could be completely just graves that were once marked, which are no longer marked, which seems to be the case when people are talking about missing children. What they mean is that the relatives don't know which area of the cemetery they're buried in. So in the case of Tanya Talaga, for example, she says her, and this is an asylum, not a residential school, but it's the same argument. I think it's her great-grandmother Annie was missing, and it was because they didn't know what cemetery Annie was buried in. And it turned out she was buried in a cemetery that's now a grassy patch next to the Gardiner Expressway. So that's not what we typically mean when we mean by missing children. Missing children are when people don't know what, like a child was at school and then that child never came home and no one knows what happened, that sort of thing. And in the case of Kamloops, we don't have anything that's not happened. And in fact, it's my understanding we don't have one name of one child who went missing in the way that people think children are missing. So there's a kind of a confusion that's going on with respect to that. And that doesn't mean that there were no clandestine burials or that there's been no foul play. It's just we're not, it seems to me we're not really starting at the right point. We have ground penetrating radar that found actually 200. It wasn't 215 because there was a mistake made by Sarah Bollier because she didn't do her groundwork to find out that the archaeology department at SFU had already excavated an area of that site. So 200, we get that GPR finding and everyone automatically went to, there's 200 children buried in that apple orchard, which we shouldn't have started at that point. We should have
agreed.
We should have had more of a basis for what we were talking about, I guess. So I certainly think if we excavated and we found remains, now we need to start doing the forensics on it to see what's what, because you could have there could be a variety of explanations for why there's burials there, but still, it would certainly move me away from the strongly disagree Matt. I would move to the slightly disagree, or maybe I would even go to the neutral, because I would now say I have no idea what that's about. Like I'll just have to start, and let people make the arguments for me to be convinced one way or the other about things.
I would like to explore the story itself, because the media's approach on this, I think, is a key conversation that we should explore. But just you made the comment, and I heard this in your other interview with the CBC, of not one parent has come forward. And so I guess my retorts to that would be TRC Volume 1 shows parents resisted Indian agents, and they had, in the 1920 amendments to the Indian Act, they made it compulsory to attend. And so this whole system is set up to force children to go to these schools, and So who would they speak to? And in speaking with Candace Malcolm, oh, well, why wouldn't they go to their chiefing council? Well, in speaking with chiefing councils, even from the 1980s, Chief Stephen Point, who's a past guest, he said we had no money, we had no funding. The Indian agent didn't really care what we had to say. Like, we had no authority back in the 1980s, let alone from 1907 to the 1980s, the terms of authority we had to make our own decisions about what we wanted to do. And if people like Bryce's, I know there's some questions about his report. If he's speaking up in Ottawa and saying, hey, this is a problem, like, we've got to do something. And even if there are little movements they're making, it certainly wasn't widespread reform. So it's not like they were hearing children were dying and going, you know what, we got to shut this down. This isn't working. We don't want any kids dying on our watch. We're not about that. Like, we've got to stop this immediately. Let's shut it down. When they closed down, there was no public like, hey, we're stopping this process in 1996. It was just, let's move on. So the idea that parents would feel comfortable going forward, to me, and I think this is meant to be a bit controversial to illustrate the point, no enslaved person committed workplace grievances with their boss, right? Like, and so for these families, who are they supposed to go speak to? What would be the course of remediation if their child did die? Who's really worrying about that when we have evidence specifically at Kamloops that one of the people was sexually abusing the children at that school? Like, is a parent going to come forward to that guy and expect that he's going to go try and get to the bottom of that and change that system? So I'd be interested in how you grapple with kind of those positions.
So if I were doing street epistemology right now, I would say, so let me make, I just want to make sure that I understand your argument, which is, because parents were sort of intimidated at that time and felt that they would not be listened to, they just didn't say anything about the child that never came home from the school. They just kept silent about it. Is that correct?
Well, I guess I would say, looking at my own community, I would say they didn't just do that. They went to the liquor store. They started drinking, which is what my grandmother did. And yep. they numbed their feelings. They committed suicide, which we know happens on reserve a lot. They committed crimes, and their life just fell apart because their child died. Like, that would be the course of action if I were to lose a child and think that nobody cares. That would be the path I would go down. It's not like they're a fully fledged person going to their 9 to 5 being like, yeah, who cares? Whatever. It's that the suicide rates are extremely high on reserve. The addiction rates are extremely high on reserve. And these pieces are part of how a person would have coped. And I see that as extremely reasonable, working within First Nation communities and seeing how people cope with the trauma they've been through, even from going to these schools, let alone potentially having to watch their child be taken away, attend these schools, even come back and have them not be able to speak the same language. Like, that relationship gap between your children would be traumatizing, let alone knowing that your kid didn't come home and it's the government and it's the police that don't care about you or your position and want you to change into something else. That seems plausible from my perspective.
So, and this again is the 6th Street epistemology method. So parents, hypothetically, parents whose children didn't come home, the reason why we don't have the names of those children and any kind of scenarios that are concrete, like we hear Lenora Joe say things like, elders have been saying for years that their peers, their siblings and so on never came home. So that's kind of the claim, but we don't know who those children were, like the names of them or anything. It's just kind of this kind of vague statement about it. But if there had been this happen, the parents might have committed suicide. And therefore, that's why we don't know the names of the children, is because the parents died and they're no longer alive to state what the names of their children were.
Correct. And that this happened over a long period of time where, to your point, nobody was keeping records of these things inside the First Nation community themselves.
Yes.
There was no, like, if the government doesn't have a formal process to document this, if you go to your chiefing council, even if they did in, say, the 1930s and went to their chiefing council and said, hey, my child was just taken from me, the documented record keeping during that period was nothing in most First Nation communities.
Yes. So I think in terms of this situation, I think that in terms of parents, first of all, it seems to me that there's a bit of these kinds of leaps of evidence. Like we're kind of breaking the chain of evidence because we're saying, and again, I think it was because of the GPR having these number of hits, and then people tried to fill in to explain why there would be children buried there, instead of starting with trying to do some investigations in the communities to get some more things on the ground about who these children were. Another interesting thing that has just come up recently is that I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but there was a task force in the 1990s, starting in around, I think, 1994, because of the Arthur Plint sexual abuse case. And the RCMP was concerned about the fact that there could be Plint was in other schools and there could be other victims. So they started this task force, which went on for about 5 years. And what happened is that they interviewed all sorts of people who had complaints of sexual abuse. And Charlene Bello, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, she was the liaison between the communities and the RCMP. So she was assisting people come forward and tell their stories. In that time frame, no one said anything about missing children or unmarked graves, and only 3 suspicious deaths were reported during that entire investigation. And it turned out the 3 suspicious deaths, it turned out some were about diseases, and one was about a suicide, and one they couldn't find out the person who was said to have been murdered by another student. Actually, it wasn't a student claimed that he'd murdered another student, but they were never able to verify that. So does information like that make you less certain about the clandestine burials in the apple orchard? The fact that no one from Kamloops mentioned anything about unmarked graves, or when we hear now that it's kind of been constantly talked about in the communities, would that be the same situation, that they're just they don't? What would be your response to that sort of information?
I think this leads perfectly into the challenge with the story itself, because I agree with you. I feel put in the position of trying to understand this story without a proper process having been followed. And now both of us are trying to understand an issue when the very simple fact of the matter, the comments that I get on the YouTube video that I did, is just go take a look. Like, just do one, and then that we can have a better understanding of this conversation. But it's like we're both stuck in this position of there's this giant question mark, and you think there's potentially nothing behind the door, and I think that there may be something behind the door, but we're almost just trying to work backwards from a really bad position of a conversation, because the story's already happened, and to so many people's points, the response has already been made. The funding has been provided. The National Truth and Reconciliation Day has taken place. The Pope has apologized. I know Stephen Harper apologized in 2008, but apologies have been made. Justin Trudeau has apologized. The response has already taken place. And so in some ways, the reaction is fait accompli, that now it's almost undoing, is the story untrue now, rather than what it should have been, which is the CBC should have done way better reporting on this than they did.
Yeah.
I'll say that a lot of stories came out between 2020 and 2024 that are worth investigating further, not just this story. And the media's quality of reporting on things has been terrible from my perspective from 2020 to basically now, as you report that there are more anomalies being found without, and sounds like leading questions are taking place. And so to me, this story is more we can continue to debate this piece, but to me, we're watching the failure of our institutions to help to properly inform us, and so we are trying to pick up the pieces of a broken system to figure out what's going on. And as I mentioned, my fear is that we are now having to carry the story on our backs as if the rest of the truths aren't the case, and we have people who are very unsympathetic to Indigenous people because of this story. And so we're carrying a lot of baggage in regards to our history, which is traumatizing, which is horrible, which I don't think you and I disagree that the results of these institutions were not good for Indigenous people overall. And we're working back from that position now. And I would just be interested in how you grapple with this story as made. You've kind of made reference to the fact we're starting from a very bizarre position.
Yes.
But what are your reflections on the story?
Yeah, so I think the residential schools are a very complicated picture with which had different times and different places in terms of, and obviously the schools themselves and the people who work there would have had a massive impact on whether it was a positive or a negative experience. I totally agree with you about the institutional failure, which I've seen myself in the university. I think that the media is a huge part of the problem, and it's largely kind of advocacy journalism instead of the way journalism used to be, where you're supposed to, kind of believe people who are making these claims, and if you don't, it shows that you're insensitive or you're not properly appreciating the colonial context. But in the universities, there's been a terrible corrosion of the universities to the point where, I was pushed out largely because of this problem, and hopefully will be reinstated if there's any justice. But I've still got to, even if I do get reinstated, I've got the problem of dealing with a university that is not fulfilling its academic mission, which we should have been able to have conversations and evidence-based discussions about the residential schools and the Kamloops case in particular. And I think that kind of has fed into the failure on all sorts of other levels. So we don't have the critical thinking going on, which is required. But one of the big things now, which I think is very important, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, is the problem of the excavations at Kamloops, is that $12.1 million has been made available to do the excavations. The band has not done the excavations, and they were supposed to have been done between 2021 and 2023. And we had Manny Jules and Ted Godfredson Jr. saying that the 13 families had agreed to do what they called the exhumations, which, of course, that's jumping the gun on this again, because in order to exhume, you have to have bodies. And we have quite a convincing argument about the septic tiles that were laid on that site in the 1920s, which are in the same configuration that Sarah Bollier found, the east-west configuration that she thought gave signs of burials. So I'm just kind of curious about what do you think should happen with respect to the excavations on that site at this point?
At this point, it's government funding. When we apply for government funding, you have to complete the expectations of the funders' purpose. So we apply for a sewage system, we have to install a sewage system. And so in this regard, if they made an application, we can read what they said they were going to do in their application, and they need to fulfill that, or they need to have the money withdrawn from them.
Okay, so I think that's kind of the first step in this, and that's not the whole story. I know it's just because Kamloops was the first kind of moment when all of this started to happen, and because Kamloops, if there were burials in the apple orchard, they'd have to be clandestine burials, because there's a cemetery that does exist on the reserve across from the Catholic Church. So the burials that are in the apple orchard, if there are burials, would have definitely be suspicious circumstances, which would then require a criminal investigation and forensic analysis. So if we could just start with Kamloops, getting people to agree that that would be a good way to at least move in a direction of sort of more rational discussion. What's going to happen after that is unknown, because as you say, there's other issues there's the clandestine burial issue, which I think there's not really been any evidence provided for that. That doesn't mean that it isn't the case. It's just we don't have any concrete information which says, okay, now we're going to go forward with some criminal investigation. But right now, that's not before us. We have a whole bunch of problems of people not knowing where their relatives are buried, which I think is Kimberly Murray's. That's what her thing was all about. But of course, the slippage into clandestine burials tended to happen all the time. So it's like people think that when we say there's 3,000 missing children that haven't been really identified in terms of where they're buried, that means that there's some kind of foul play that's taken place. So I think, in my own view, I think the media, this should, if we're going to be wanting to improve society, first of all, we have to think about Aboriginal people and marginalized Aboriginal people, how to address the suffering and the terrible circumstances. But getting people to think that there's a whole bunch of murdered children in a Kamloops apple orchard, which it's claimed has traumatized a whole bunch of members of the Aboriginal community, that's not assisting anyone in trying to come to terms with how to improve various conditions. So I think that there's, serious problems that have been made for Aboriginal people, and then, a lot of concerns that people have who, don't want Canada to be seen in a bad light or these sorts of things, which, okay, I do accept that, but I think the focus should be on, we have serious grievances, legitimate grievances that Aboriginal people have. Those need to be addressed, but having stories being told which are not based on evidence, that's not going to enable that to occur in any meaningful way, and is going to cause more and more kinds of conflicts, both within Aboriginal communities and between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal population.
I tend to agree with you. When I look at this story, I see a failure of the media to report accurately, and they released that press release. But I don't think they could have, I don't think Kamloops or Chief Casimir ever suspected it was going to reach this level or have the response that it did. And a good media would have pushed back or asked more probing questions. And so to me, that interaction has resulted in a lot of funding that many point out as an example. But when they submitted that, I guarantee you they didn't think that it was going to make worldwide headlines and change the zeitgeist understanding of where Canadians are in terms of their relationship with their own country. I don't think they knew that it was going to result in greater 246 million funding or more in terms of more research. I don't think they expected it was going to result in National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I don't think they saw all of that coming. And this is where I think listeners will call me a grifter. I will say, I think some of that relationship and some of that change was long overdue, because before 2021, I had heard people, I had no idea this happened. I had no idea. I didn't know. I didn't realize. I didn't know that it was this bad. I didn't learn that in school. I had no experience. Now everybody knows. But there's this chink in the armor. There's this problem with the story that is harming Canadians' ability to fully grapple with the real history that is not disputed by you or I in terms of what happened, because this issue is taking up all the oxygen in the room. It's taking up our full interview, where I would love to be able to chat about what happened at the university, the importance of intellectual integrity within universities, and have more fulsome conversations about where we could go. It's taking up so much energy, and I think there are a lot of parties participating in that. But I feel like it did bring on a national shame. And I think that a lot of that national shame was deserved, not all of it, but that Canadians really didn't understand what happened, and they didn't understand all of the sexual abuse. And I would have hoped that this would have opened a conversation to what you mentioned earlier. How do we get Indigenous people out of poverty? How do we make the reserve system fair so everybody has an equal opportunity to succeed? How do we make sure that the education rates and the crime rates on reserves are not as bad as they are today? I would have hoped that when we were ready, when Canadians were ready for this conversation, it would have resulted in a much more progressive, useful conversation than do we dig or do we not dig? And that feels like the circumstance that we're stuck in right now. And all of the discussion around the real circumstances of First Nations reserves is completely being ignored. And there's bad faith actors from my perspective on both sides. And it's making it a very unproductive process in terms of the reconciliation project.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to push back against you a little bit, Aaron.
Sure.
I think the band, well, first of all, Manny Jules, who was the chief before, a longtime chief, he was well aware, or said he was well aware of the kind of implications that this was going to have. I think the band, and this is the roles of the lawyers, that there's a lot of lawyers in this whole thing who understand the consequences of these kinds of claims in terms of facilitating more legal disputes and so on, which is kind of the nature of a great deal of these Aboriginal policy regimes. But the band has not been innocent in this, what's happened, because, and Sarah Bollier is another person who should take some responsibility for what's happened, because I do see a number of archaeologists, Andrew Martindale, Terence Clark are two, Keisha Supernant's another one, who really mislead Aboriginal communities with what GPR means. And they know better than this. But because of what happened with Sarah Bollier and the band, the actions of some members of the leadership, that press release got written the way that it was. And the band, quite a few months after it was known in the July 15th presentation by Sarah Bollier that excavations would be needed to confirm, the band kept on making claims again and again that the remains of children had been found at Kamloops. And they were doing that as recently as September 2024 in a conversation that Ted Godfredson Jr. and Dee DeRose, who's the chancellor of Thompson Rivers University, were having about this. So, and I don't know that, I don't want to say that it's intentional deception, because there could just be Aboriginal leaders are having a hard time kind of understanding the difference between a belief that something is true and something that is actually true. So it could be very well be that Ted Godfredson Jr. believes that there's children buried in the apple orchard. It's entirely possible, but it's very irresponsible for the academic establishment not to be having this kind of conversation where we say, just because you believe something is true, it doesn't mean it's true. You need to have corroborating evidence to support your belief in order to get other people to accept that it's true. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to believe whatever beliefs you have, but if you're expecting other people to act upon that, especially if you're expecting public policy to be developed on the basis of this belief, then that's when our institutions should be operating. But I think the band acted, many actors, not the entire band, like this is just a few people. They acted in a very, very irresponsible fashion, and they've never really owned up to this, that of what they did. Maybe it was accidental and they just got drawn into it. And I know it's always hard for people to admit that they made a mistake. Like that's possible too. Like you're just swept up in everything. But we've gone way too far now. We have all these things that have happened. We need to have a reckoning on it. And but there's kind of resistance because of all the institutions and not wanting to be seen like you're being heavy-handed about all these things, all these kinds of problems. But I don't think that's going to work. And it's just going to make a whole bunch of people more and more angry that we're not getting to the truth of this matter. And we need to also avoid some kind of overcorrection. What's called an overcorrection is that just because there was some problematic behavior that happened at Kamloops, that doesn't mean that everything that was claimed about the residential schools now also is totally invalid or anything. We have to develop an evidence-based approach to try to understand what's going on. And there's a reluctance to do that amongst many people because you don't want to seem like you're being a insensitive person with a colonial mindset who's just trying to put people in their place and not address, some real problems that do exist. So, I think the band should be held to account for what it's done. But I also think that it's in the context of a much wider institutional failure, that's got to be recognized too. And the universities, what they've done is just terrible. And this is my own university. I know exactly what happened at my own university, and it has behaved absolutely terribly. And the administration has got to take responsibility for what it's done, and hopefully it will at some point in time. And a bunch of other universities did this too.
I agree with you. I think the universities need to reflect on what their role in a healthy society is and zoom back out, because even in my own experience, I had a tremendous experience at the University of the Fraser Valley where Sarah Boulot works, where I was taught how to debate, how to defend a position, how to steelman arguments, how to understand positions, and do my best to carry that forward. And then unfortunately, at Peter A. Allard School of Law at UBC, we did not debate that much. It was during the period of COVID where almost all of the students agreed with the approach being taken by government. There wasn't a sense of when the government says something, you should question it for good, for bad, on day one and on day 365. Not because there isn't good intentions, but because even with best intentions, the worst can happen. And that needs to always be ever present in our mind when we're considering these issues. And I have seen many universities fall away from that. And I've, to your point, seen First Nations not want to participate in this conversation. And if we don't show up in this conversation, if we look avoidant to it, then the term grifters, the comment section will continue to be true, because I've asked many First Nations chiefs, what are your perspectives on this? And either they don't know, or they don't want to know, or they're not that interested in the topic. But the claim is extraordinary, and it has extraordinary ramifications. And somebody has to be willing to have the conversation. And I'd really rather it not be me. This is not my area of expertise. I'm not an archaeologist. It's not what I want to be focused on, but I can see it's starting to have implications with the provincial government and with the federal government. I can see that they don't want to continue to, as I said, reconciliation was not a topic in the last election, partly because the economy was so terrible, but also because this is a part of the story. And if you focus on reconciliation and what's been done, then you also have to be willing to answer questions from reporters on these other pieces, and nobody wants to do that. And in speaking with Minister Gary Anand-Sangare, it's clear that they do not think about these issues as deeply as individuals like yourself do, and so they have no interest in getting into a discussion or a complex, nuanced debate on these issues. And so I really hope we can have institutions come back to the table in a good way. I will honestly say I was embarrassed with how you were interviewed by the CBC, because those are First Nation communities that are being represented with that perspective. And when you see that there's nothing to the argument, that there's no analysis, that she hadn't read the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission, she hadn't read any of the volumes, and yet she was supposed to be reporting on on our history, on where we are, on what our perspectives are, that makes me extremely uncomfortable, and why it was such a privilege to have you on today. I really appreciate the discussion. There were no bad faith antics on either end. I think these conversations are incredibly important because they remind universities and the media that we can have complex discussions and that nobody needs to shy away from that, that in fact we learn a lot from each other when we do such things, and we don't have to walk away with malice or frustration or a sense of bad faith on the other side. So, Frances, I'm grateful that you were willing to come on. I imagine that, as Nigel Bagar had said, like a little nervous about how this was going to be approached, but I hope you know that I meant all good faith throughout the conversation.
I wasn't nervous at all because I've seen you in your other podcasts, and it was a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Fantastic. How can people follow your work moving forward?
So I'm on Twitter, so I'm doing a lot on, and I think it's Frances Widows 1. I've got a YouTube channel, Frances Widdowson 1600, which I'm posting a lot of videos on. I'm on Facebook, which I do post regularly there. And then there's my case, which is at the www.wokeacademy.info, if people are interested in what happened at Mount Royal University.
Thank you, Frances, so much for being willing to have this conversation.
Thanks for having me on.